15 years is a long time to build something. Long enough that the thing you're building stops feeling like a project and starts feeling like an extension of yourself. Every fence post you drove, every pasture you cleared, every pre-dawn morning you spent in cold you hadn't quite dressed enough for because the work couldn't wait. My Colorado mountain ranch was a physical record of that time, and I knew every acre the way you know your own house in the dark, instinctively, completely, without having to look. Linda Brooks had been HOA president for 2 years when she decided my ranch was her new renovation project. I don't mean that literally. She didn't want to improve the property. She wanted to control it, which is a different thing entirely. The specific hunger of certain people for authority over spaces and choices that have nothing to do with them. My fencing violated her aesthetic sensibility. My barn was positioned incorrectly relative to some standard she'd apparently invented. My mailbox had become, through reasoning I was never fully able to follow, a community concern. She filed complaints the way some people file their nails, regularly and as a matter of habit, seemingly unbothered by whether they were going anywhere. I ignored her, which I understood even at the time would not make things better, but seemed like the only response proportionate to the actual situation. My ranch predated her involvement in the neighborhood by over a decade. Every structure on the property had been built to code and approved through proper channels. There was nothing she could touch, and I believed, incorrectly as it turned out, that this reality would eventually bore her into focusing on someone else. What I didn't account for was that some people, when ignored, don't lose interest. They escalate. The keys went missing on a Thursday. I noticed it that evening when I went to lock the barn and reached the hook where I always left them, the ring with the barn lock, the equipment shed, the gate padlocks, all of it, and found the hook empty. I did the full search. Truck cab, jacket pockets, every surface in the kitchen and office, the workbench in the barn itself. Nothing. I'm not a man who misplaces things habitually, but I also wasn't immediately suspicious. Keys disappear. It happens. What made me pull up the security footage wasn't suspicion. It was a feeling. The specific low-frequency unease that doesn't have a name, but that people who've spent time in environments where things can go wrong learn to take seriously. I'd had that feeling before in contexts where the stakes were considerably higher than a missing key ring, and I'd learned not to argue with it. The footage answered my question clearly enough. I won't detail exactly what it showed, but I'll say this. What I saw near my front entrance the previous afternoon was not the wind, and it was not me. I copied the relevant files to a drive, stored them somewhere secure, and went to bed. I had phone calls to make in the morning, and I wanted to make them from a rested, composed place rather than from wherever I'd end up if I let myself stay angry about what I just watched. Linda arrived the next morning with her brother Mark, who happened to be a county deputy. She had clearly briefed him on the way over, because he stepped out of the vehicle with the bearing of someone who's been told he's arriving at a problem and has accepted that characterization before seeing any evidence. He was professional about it. Mark carried himself with the discipline of someone who takes the job seriously, but he was operating on one source of information, and that source was his sister, and his sister had a history of creative interpretation where my property was concerned. Linda did most of the talking, which was consistent with her general approach to conflict. She had a gift for framing, presenting her position with such confident specificity that the listener's brain begins filling in the supporting evidence she hasn't actually provided. She talked about HOA regulations, community standards, uncooperative residents. She gestured at my property with the proprietary air of someone who has spent enough time complaining about a place that she started to feel a kind of ownership over it. I let her finish. I found, over the years, that people who are performing confidence rather than actually possessing it will eventually run out of material if you don't interrupt them. Linda ran out faster than I expected. Then I asked Mark if I could show him something. Here's the thing about evidence. It doesn't argue. It doesn't have a tone or an agenda or a sister it's trying to protect. It just sits there being accurate, and you either account for it or you don't. I had spent enough of my professional life, 22 years in federal investigations before I retired to this ranch, watching people try to talk their way around documentation, to know that the documentation almost always wins. I walked Mark through everything systematically. The property records first, boundaries, easements, every structure properly permitted and recorded. Then the HOA communications filed chronologically. showing a pattern of complaints that had never been accompanied by any legitimate regulatory basis. Then the security footage. I watched Mark's professional composure absorb what he was seeing with the careful attention of someone recalibrating in real time. He asked a few questions. I answered them directly. He asked to see something again, and I replayed it. When he was done, he was quiet for a moment in the way that people are quiet when they're reorganizing what they thought they knew. He looked at his sister. Linda was no longer speaking. The confidence that had been her primary instrument throughout this entire period had simply switched off. The way a light goes off when you cut the power, immediately and completely. Mark and I spoke for a while longer, just the two of us near the gate, while Linda stood by the vehicle saying nothing. He was honest with me, which I respected. He said he'd come out here believing he was helping resolve a neighborhood dispute, and had not anticipated the morning taking the shape it had taken. I told him I understood, and I meant it. Linda was a sister, and loyalty to family is not a character flaw, even when the family member turns out to be wrong. What matters is what you do when you find out they're wrong. Mark did the right things from that point forward, and I've never said anything different. The subsequent weeks involved conversations I won't detail publicly, processes that move at the pace official processes move, and a particular institutional machinery that engages when a deputy realizes his presence at a property was based on a story that the evidence doesn't support. I made calls to people I'd worked with for 2 decades who pulled threads I didn't need to pull myself, and the picture that emerged was consistent with what I'd already documented. Linda Brooks stepped back from her HOA involvement not long after. In the way people step back when the alternative is being pushed, she didn't announce it dramatically. She just stopped showing up to meetings, stopped filing complaints, stopped appearing at my fence line with opinions about my mailbox. The sudden silence where her presence had been was, honestly, more noticeable than the presence itself. My workers noticed a change before I said anything to them. The foreman mentioned it one morning while we were checking the east fence. Said the place felt different, easier, like someone that had been humming at a frequency just below hearing had finally stopped. I knew exactly what he meant. I sit on the porch most evenings now, in the hour before the light goes flat, watching the horses work their way across the lower pasture in that unhurried way they move when nothing is bothering them. 15 years of work visible from a single vantage point, every acre of it earned and documented and, as it turned out, defensible. I spent 2 decades in work that required me to believe in the power of evidence over assumption, process over pressure, patience over reaction. The ranch was supposed to be my retirement from all of that. Simpler, quieter, free of the machinery. What I discovered instead is that the skills don't retire when you do. They just wait for the moment they're needed again. They were needed. They worked. The ranch is still mine. The footage is still on that drive. And every evening the mountain does what mountains do. Sits there enormous and indifferent, making all of this seem very small and very manageable in the best possible way. I prefer it that way. I always have. If you know someone building something worth protecting, send them this. And if you've dealt with a neighbor who confused position with authority, the comments section is yours.